Carl Jung called it the most psychologically sophisticated narrative in Western literature, yet most people completely miss what's actually happening. The story of Jesus' temptation in the desert isn't a morality tale about resisting sin or a demonstration of willpower over demonic forces. Jung recognized it as something far more radical and far more relevant to understanding why systems of power always corrupt and why every revolution eventually becomes what it overthrew. In those 40 days and 3 temptations, Jung saw a precise psychological map of how power operates, how it seduces consciousness, and most importantly, how it can be transcended. What makes this story so psychologically brilliant is that it reveals the 3 fundamental mechanisms through which the ego maintains control over consciousness. The 3 ways that what the Gnostics called the demiurge keeps humanity trapped in identification with limitation. And Jesus, in Jung's reading, isn't fighting an external devil. He's confronting the internal psychological forces that every human being who seeks liberation must face and transcend. The devil in the desert is the voice of the ego itself, offering the 3 forms of power that keep consciousness asleep, that maintain the prison of conditioned existence, that prevent awakening to what you actually are beyond all roles and identities. And what makes the temptation narrative so disturbing when you understand its psychological meaning is that these same 3 temptations are being offered to you constantly, every day, through every system of control that benefits from keeping you identified with your limited ego self rather than awakened to your true nature. The first temptation happens after Jesus has been fasting for 40 days. The devil appears and says, "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become bread." On the surface, this seems like a straightforward temptation to satisfy physical hunger, to use spiritual power for material comfort. But Jung saw something far more psychologically sophisticated happening. This is the temptation of believing that your value, your identity, your worth comes from your ability to control and manipulate the material world. It's the seduction of defining yourself through your capacity to get what you want, to satisfy your desires, to demonstrate mastery over physical reality. The devil is essentially saying, prove who you are through what you can do, establish your identity through your power to transform stones into bread, to manifest material reality according to your will. This is the fundamental trap of ego consciousness. The ego defines itself through what it can control, what it can acquire, what it can manipulate. Your worth becomes measured by your possessions, your achievements, your ability to bend the world to match your desires. And this seems perfectly natural, even admirable, in a culture built on material success, on the demonstration of power through control over matter. Jung recognized this as the demiurge's first and most basic control mechanism. If you can convince consciousness that it is defined by its relationship to material reality, by its ability to satisfy bodily desires, by its success in accumulating and controlling physical resources, then you've trapped it in identification with the body and its needs. The person becomes a consumer, someone whose entire existence is organized around getting and having and using material things. They're not consciously aware they're in a prison because the prison looks like the pursuit of reasonable goals, like taking care of basic needs, like achieving success and security. But Jung saw that this is precisely how the ego maintains its dominance. It keeps consciousness focused outward, on the material world, on the endless pursuit of satisfaction through external acquisition. And the brilliant psychological insight is that this satisfaction never actually comes. Turn stones into bread today, and tomorrow you're hungry again. Acquire one thing, and you immediately desire the next. The mechanism is designed to be endless, to keep you perpetually seeking, perpetually identified with lack, perpetually believing that the next material acquisition will finally bring the fulfillment that always remains just out of reach. Jesus' response cuts through this entire mechanism with surgical precision. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Jung interpreted this not as religious piety, but as a psychological reorientation. Jesus is refusing to define himself through his power over matter, refusing to establish his identity through what he can get or control or manipulate in the material world. He's pointing to a different source of life, a different foundation for identity, what Jung would call the self, rather than the ego. The self doesn't need to prove itself through demonstrations of power. It doesn't need to constantly acquire to feel secure. It exists prior to all material conditions and remains whole regardless of what the physical world provides or withholds. This refusal of the first temptation is the refusal to let your worth be determined by your success in manipulating matter, to let your identity be reduced to your role as consumer and accumulator, to let your consciousness be trapped in the endless cycle of desire and temporary satisfaction that keeps you identified with the body and its needs rather than awakened to what you are beyond all material conditions. The second temptation reveals an even more sophisticated mechanism of control. The devil takes Jesus to the pinnacle of the temple and says, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down. For it is written, He will command His angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone." This temptation is far more psychologically complex than the first. It's not about satisfying bodily needs or acquiring material things. It's about demonstrating your specialness, proving your unique relationship with the divine, establishing yourself as above and separate from ordinary humanity. The devil is essentially offering Jesus the power of spectacle, the ability to perform a miracle that would force everyone to acknowledge his superiority, to submit to his authority, to recognize him as uniquely chosen and protected by God. This is the temptation of spiritual inflation, of using your connection to the divine not for liberation but for domination, not for awakening others but for establishing yourself as the one who is already awake while others sleep. Jung saw this as perhaps the most dangerous temptation because it disguises itself as spirituality while actually serving the ego's need for superiority. The person who can perform miracles, who can demonstrate special powers, who can prove they have a unique relationship with the divine, this person gains tremendous power over others. And this power feels righteous because it's cloaked in spiritual language, presented as service to God, framed as helping others by showing them the way. But psychologically, it's the ego's bid for dominance through spiritual achievement rather than material success. The mechanism is the same. Prove your worth, establish your identity, demonstrate your superiority. The only difference is that instead of pointing to your wealth or your possessions or your control over matter, you point to your spiritual attainments, your special relationship with God, your ability to access powers that ordinary people cannot. Jung observed this pattern constantly in religious communities and spiritual movements. The person who has mystical experiences begins to identify as the mystic, superior to those who haven't had such experiences. The person who achieves some level of awakening becomes the teacher who maintains their identity through having students who are less awake. The person who can heal or prophesy or perform spiritual feats uses these abilities to establish a hierarchy with themselves at the top, chosen and special and separate from the unenlightened masses below. This is the demiurge's second control mechanism, and it's more insidious than the first because it captures precisely those people who have moved beyond identification with material power. You've transcended the need to define yourself through your possessions or your ability to manipulate matter. You've recognized that consciousness is not reducible to the body and its desires, but instead of moving to genuine liberation, you get trapped in a new form of ego identification, this time through your spiritual specialness, your unique relationship with the divine, your superior level of development. And the trap is maintained through the need for others to recognize your specialness, to acknowledge your superiority, to submit to your spiritual authority. You need disciples, followers, people who will look up to you and validate your identity as the enlightened one, the chosen one, the one with special access to divine power. The moment you need others to see you as special, you're trapped in ego identification regardless of how spiritual it appears. Jesus' response again cuts directly to the psychological mechanism. You shall not put the Lord your God to the test. Jung interpreted this as a refusal to use the divine for ego purposes, to instrumentalize spiritual power for establishing superiority, to perform demonstrations that would force recognition of specialness. The true relationship with the divine, what Jung called the relationship between ego and self, doesn't need external validation. It doesn't require others to acknowledge it. It doesn't use spiritual power to establish hierarchy or prove superiority. The self is not special in the sense of being separate from and superior to others. It's the universal ground of consciousness that exists equally in all beings, hidden beneath the various forms of ego identification. To demand a sign, to perform a spectacle, to force acknowledgement of your unique relationship with God, this is to reduce the divine to an instrument of ego inflation. It's to use spirituality for power over others rather than for liberation from the need for power entirely. The third temptation is the most revealing and the most relevant to understanding why every revolutionary movement eventually becomes corrupt, why every attempt to change systems from within eventually gets captured by those systems, why power always corrupts regardless of how pure the intentions were at the start. The devil takes Jesus to a high mountain and shows him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory, saying, "All these I will give you if you will fall down and worship me." This is the ultimate temptation, the offer of total worldly power, the ability to control not just matter or other individuals, but entire systems, nations, civilizations. And it comes with a condition that reveals the true nature of how systemic power operates. You must worship the devil, you must acknowledge and serve the demiurge, You must operate according to the principles that maintain the prison of conditioned consciousness. Jung understood this as the most sophisticated psychological trap because it appeals to the highest motivations. The devil isn't offering Jesus the kingdoms for selfish enjoyment or ego gratification. The implicit promise is that with this power, Jesus could end suffering, establish justice, create the kingdom of God on earth through political and social control. He could force humanity to behave righteously, could eliminate evil through the proper exercise of authority, could save everyone through the intelligent application of systemic power. This is the seduction that captures every revolutionary, every reformer, every person who sees the injustice of existing systems and believes they could do better if only they had the power. And the trap is that to gain this power, to operate within these systems, to climb to the position where you could actually make changes, you must make compromises. You must worship the devil, which Jung interpreted as accepting and operating according to the principles of ego consciousness, the mechanisms of control and domination that maintain the demiurge's power. You tell yourself the compromises are temporary, that once you have sufficient power you'll use it differently, that you're just playing the game to get into position to change the rules. But Jung saw that the compromises aren't temporary. The process of gaining power within a system transforms you. You become shaped by the very mechanisms you intended to change. The system doesn't get reformed from within. The reformer gets captured by the system. This is why every revolution becomes what it overthrew. The revolutionaries who fought against tyranny become tyrants once they take power. The activists who oppose corruption become corrupt once they enter the system. The spiritual teachers who preach liberation become authoritarian once they establish institutions. The mechanism is inevitable because systemic power operates according to specific principles, and to wield that power, you must internalize and embody those principles. You must think in terms of control and domination, must see people as resources to be managed, must prioritize the preservation and expansion of your power over the liberation of consciousness. The kingdoms of the world are offered, but only on the condition that you worship the devil, that you accept and operate according to ego consciousness rather than self-consciousness, that you use the tools of the demiurge to try to defeat the demiurge. And Jung recognized this as impossible. You cannot liberate consciousness using the mechanisms designed to trap consciousness. You cannot awaken people by controlling them. You cannot establish the kingdom of God through the kingdoms of the world because they operate according to opposite principles. The kingdoms of the world are built on hierarchy, control, domination, the concentration of power in the hands of those who have proven their willingness to do whatever it takes to gain and maintain that power. The kingdom that Jesus taught, what Jung called the realization of the self, is built on the dissolution of hierarchy, the abandonment of control, the recognition that consciousness cannot be dominated because it's not separate or other, but is the universal ground of all experience. Jesus' response to this ultimate temptation is the most absolute. Be gone, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve. Jung saw this as the complete rejection of systemic power as a path to liberation. Jesus is refusing the offer not because he lacks compassion for those suffering under existing systems, not because he doesn't want to end injustice and create a better world. He refuses because he recognizes that the power being offered operates according to principles that would prevent the very liberation he's teaching. You cannot serve two masters. You cannot worship God, which Jung understood as orienting consciousness toward the self, while also worshiping the devil, operating according to the principles of ego domination and systemic control. The choice is absolute. Either you work within the systems of worldly power, accepting their principles and gradually being shaped by them until you become indistinguishable from what you opposed, or you refuse that power entirely and work according to a completely different principle, what Jesus called the kingdom of God and Jung called individuation. What Jung discovered in analyzing the temptation narrative is that all three temptations reveal the same fundamental truth about power. It always operates through identification with the ego rather than awakening to the self. The first temptation offers power over matter through identifying with your ability to satisfy desires and control physical reality. The second temptation offers power over others through identifying with your spiritual specialness and superior relationship to the divine. The third temptation offers power over systems through identifying with your role as controller and reformer of collective structures. And all three require the same thing: remaining asleep to your true nature, staying identified with a limited role or position or capacity, believing that you are the ego with its needs and desires and ambitions rather than the self that has no need for power because it's not separate from what it would seek to control. This is why Jesus' refusals are so psychologically significant. He's not demonstrating willpower or moral righteousness. He's refusing to accept the basic premise underlying all three temptations, the premise that identity comes from what you can do or control or achieve or demonstrate. He's pointing to a completely different ground of being, what Jung called the self, what the Gnostics called the divine spark, what Jesus himself called the kingdom of God within. The power that Jesus embodies, the power that Jung spent his life trying to help people access, isn't power over anything. It's not the ability to control matter or dominate others or reform systems. It's the power that comes from recognizing what you actually are beyond all the false identifications, beyond all the roles and positions and achievements that the ego uses to establish itself. This power doesn't need to be demonstrated because it's not based on what you can do. It doesn't need others to acknowledge it because it's not dependent on external validation. It doesn't need to control systems because it's not operating according to the principles of systemic power. It's the power of consciousness awakening to itself, recognizing its own nature, withdrawing from identification with the limited ego self, and realizing the unlimited self that was always already present beneath all the conditioning and false identification. And this is why the temptation narrative is so relevant today, perhaps more than ever. We live in a world that offers all three temptations constantly and simultaneously. Consumer culture offers the first temptation, the promise that if you just acquire enough, control enough, manipulate matters successfully enough, you'll finally be satisfied and secure. Social media and influencer culture offer the second temptation, the promise that if you demonstrate your specialness, prove your superiority, get enough followers to validate your unique worth, you'll finally feel seen and significant. Political movements and activism offer the third temptation, the promise that if you just gain enough systemic power, reform the right institutions, implement the correct policies, you'll finally create justice and end suffering. And Jung's analysis of Jesus' temptation reveals why none of these paths lead to liberation. They all require remaining identified with the ego, staying asleep to your true nature, believing that you are the limited self that needs power rather than the unlimited self that has no need for power because it's not separate from anything it would seek to control. The desert confrontation wasn't about resisting evil. It was about recognizing and refusing the mechanisms that keep consciousness trapped in ego identification. It was about seeing clearly how power operates to maintain the prison and choosing a completely different path, the path of awakening rather than dominating, of realizing the self rather than inflating the ego, of liberation rather than control. Jesus' 40 days in the desert, in Jung's interpretation, represent the confrontation that every person seeking liberation must eventually face. You will be offered all three forms of power. You will be tempted to define yourself through what you can control, to establish your worth through your specialness, to change the world through systemic domination. And you will have to recognize that accepting any of these offers means remaining in the prison, staying identified with the limited ego self, continuing to operate according to the principles of the demiurge rather than awakening to the self. The path Jesus demonstrated, the path Jung decoded, is the path of refusal, not refusal through denial or repression, but refusal through recognition. You see clearly how these forms of power operate, what they offer, what they require, and what they cost. And you recognize that the cost is consciousness itself, is remaining asleep, is staying trapped in identification with limitation. The true power, the only power that doesn't corrupt, is the power that comes from withdrawing identification from the ego and awakening to the self. This power doesn't need to control anything because it recognizes that consciousness is not separate from what it would control. It doesn't need to demonstrate specialness because it recognizes that the divine ground is equally present in all beings beneath their various forms of ego identification. It doesn't need to reform systems because it recognizes that systems built on ego consciousness cannot liberate consciousness, that true liberation happens one individual at a time through the difficult work of individuation, through each person confronting their own desert temptation and making the same choice Jesus made. If this exploration of Jung's interpretation of Jesus' temptation has revealed something about the nature of power and how it keeps consciousness trapped, if you recognize the three temptations operating in your own life and in the systems around you, if you're ready to understand what it means to refuse power in favor of awakening, then subscribe to this channel, because we're continuing to decode these ancient narratives through the lens of depth psychology, revealing the practical methods for liberation that have been hidden in plain sight, translating the wisdom that institutions have obscured into language that modern consciousness can understand and apply. The temptations haven't changed, the mechanisms of power haven't changed, but the path of refusal, the path of awakening, the path that Jesus demonstrated and Jung decoded, remains available for those willing to face their own desert confrontation and choose consciousness over control.